Naomi Brooks could walk into any room in the country and watch every executive rise to their feet because she was the most powerful black CEO on Wall Street, a woman whose name alone could move markets. But on this particular evening, she did something no one who knew her would have believed. She put on a wrinkled cardigan, smudged her makeup on purpose, and walked into a blind date looking like a woman nobody would glance at twice. Only one man pulled out her chair, smiled, without hesitation, and gave her his full quiet respect. He had no idea he was turning down a life of unimaginable wealth to choose something far more valuable instead. Naomi Brooks had just closed the largest acquisition of her career, a $4.8 billion merger that made the front page of every financial paper in the country. She had built her company from a small consulting practice, with only 3 employees, into a sprawling empire that touched real estate manufacturing and technology across 2 continents, and she had done it while facing skepticism at every single turn. From investors who doubted a young black woman could manage that kind of capital to competitors who assumed she had inherited rather than earned her position. Reporters had started calling her the Queen of Wall Street, a title she wore the way other people wore armor, because underneath the tailored suits and the confident handshakes was a woman who had not trusted a man's intentions in nearly a decade. She remembered sometimes late at night in her empty penthouse, the early years when she worked 18-hour days just to be taken seriously in rooms full of men twice her age, and how strange it felt now to have all the money and influence she once dreamed of, yet still lie awake, wondering if anyone would ever want to know her without an agenda attached. Every date she had gone on in the last 5 years had followed the same pattern. The men researched her stock portfolio before they researched her favorite color. One had proposed after only 3 weeks, sliding a prenuptial agreement across a candlelit table instead of a ring box, as though love were simply another contract to be negotiated. Another had spent an entire dinner asking about her real estate holdings and never once asked how her day had been. Naomi began to wonder if there was a single person left in the world who could look at her and see a woman instead of a balance sheet. There had been a man named Daniel, a few years earlier, who seemed genuine at first, bringing her flowers and remembering small details from their conversations, until she discovered he had been quietly asking mutual acquaintances about her company's valuation before every single date. There had been another man who introduced her to his family within a month, only for his mother to spend the entire dinner asking pointed questions about prenuptial arrangements and inheritance structures, as though love were simply a transaction waiting to be finalized. Each disappointment chipped away a little more of the trust Naomi once carried so easily, until she stopped answering calls from dating services altogether. She stopped accepting introductions from colleagues who promised every single time that this one was different because she had heard that same promise more times than she could count, and it had never once turned out to be true. Her best friend Vanessa Cole watched all of this happen from the sidelines for years, and one evening over a bottle of wine in Naomi's penthouse, Vanessa finally said what she had been thinking for a long time. She reminded Naomi of the countless nights they had spent laughing about ridiculous first dates in their early 20s back, before either of them had a single dollar to their name, back when men pursued them for their laughter and their opinions rather than their bank statements. Vanessa admitted that she sometimes missed being ordinary, admitted that there was a strange kind of freedom in being unremarkable, a freedom Naomi had not experienced since the day her first company went public. She told Naomi that maybe the problem was not the men themselves, but the fact that every man she met already knew exactly who she was before he ever sat down across from her, arriving at each date with expectations already shaped by headlines and net worth estimates rather than curiosity. Vanessa suggested a simple rule for the next date. Do not tell him you are a CEO. Let him find out who you are, the way anyone else would, through conversation, through small moments, through the way you laugh at something unexpected. Naomi laughed off the suggestion, at first insisting it sounded like something out of an old movie, but the idea lingered in her mind for days afterward, refusing to let her go. Naomi turned the idea over for days, and then she decided to take it further than Vanessa had ever intended. If she wanted the truth, she would need to remove every advantage that came with her appearance, her wealth, and her name. She would dress the way an ordinary, overlooked woman might dress on any given Tuesday, and she would watch closely to see what kind of man would still choose to be kind to her when there was nothing to gain from it. It was, she told herself quietly, less a game and more a final experiment. One last honest attempt before she resigned herself to the idea that a genuine connection was simply not something available to a woman in her position, no matter how much she still secretly wished otherwise. On the night of the date, Naomi stood in front of her mirror in an outfit pulled from the back of her closet, a faded cardigan scuffed flats and hair pulled into a plain, unremarkable bun, an ensemble so far removed from the tailored designer pieces that filled the rest of her wardrobe that she barely recognized her own reflection staring back at her. She smudged her eyeliner just slightly enough to look tired rather than polished, and she left her diamond earrings in their box, along with the platinum watch she wore to nearly every meeting, choosing instead a plain digital watch she had, bought years earlier, and never once worn in public. Vanessa had offered to come along and watch discreetly from a distance, partly out of concern and partly out of sheer curiosity, wanting to see for herself whether this strange experiment would end the way Naomi hoped or confirm every fear she had been carrying for years. When she walked into the small, elegant restaurant that Vanessa had chosen, something strange happened. The hostess barely looked at her, offering only a distracted nod, before turning back to a well-dressed couple checking in behind her. A group of well-dressed patrons near the entrance let their eyes slide right past her as if she had become invisible the moment she stepped through the door. And for a woman who had spent the last several years commanding the attention of entire boardrooms, the moment she entered them, the sensation was jarring in a way she had not anticipated. She stood near the entrance for a moment, feeling smaller than she had felt in years, and wondered briefly if this experiment had been a mistake, before she spotted a man rising from a table near the window, his eyes already fixed on her with unmistakable warmth. Ethan Walker had already been seated for 10 minutes when Naomi arrived, and he stood the instant he saw her walking toward the table. He was dressed in a suit that had clearly seen better years, the fabric slightly worn at the elbows, but pressed and cared for with obvious pride. He pulled out her chair before she could reach for it herself, and he asked in a voice that carried no performance in it at all whether she was cold, because the restaurant kept the air conditioning running high in the summer months. He signaled the waiter and ordered her a glass of water before she had even settled into her seat, simply because he noticed her lips were slightly dry from the walkover. The restaurant was warm and softly lit, the kind of place where candlelight flickered against polished silverware and quiet jazz drifted from hidden speakers. And Naomi found herself studying Ethan's face for the first hints of disappointment that usually appeared on a man's face when he realized his date had not made much of an effort with her appearance. That flicker never came. He simply smiled at her the way a person smiles when they are genuinely glad to be exactly where they are. A few minutes later, the same waiter, who had greeted the well-dressed couples at the neighboring tables with warm smiles, returned to their table with a clipped, indifferent tone, barely making eye contact with Naomi, as he rattled off the specials in a rushed, bored voice, as though her order mattered less than everyone else's in the room. Ethan noticed immediately. He did not raise his voice or make a scene, but he asked calmly and firmly that his date be treated with the same courtesy as every other guest in the restaurant. The waiter's demeanor shifted instantly, and Naomi sat there in stunned silence, unsure of what she had just witnessed. In all her years of dating, no one had ever defended her from something so small, so easily ignored, so easily excused. As the evening continued, Naomi waited for the questions she had grown used to bracing herself against. She waited for him to ask what she did for work, how much she made, what kind of car she drove, what neighborhood she lived in. None of those questions ever came. Instead, Ethan leaned forward with genuine curiosity in his eyes and asked her a single question that no one had asked her in years. He wanted to know what made her happiest, not professionally, not financially, but as a person in the quiet moments when no one else was watching. Naomi sat there for a long moment, searching for an honest answer, realizing with a strange ache in her chest that she could not remember the last time someone had cared enough to ask. She finally admitted, almost shyly, that she loved waking up before sunrise to watch the city lights fade into morning, A small ritual she had never shared with anyone because it seemed too ordinary to mention. Ethan told her that ordinary things were usually the ones worth remembering the most, and something about the simplicity of his answer settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Naomi felt like an actual human being sitting across from another human being rather than a target to be studied and pursued. She began to relax into the conversation, laughing at small things, sharing opinions she normally kept guarded, forgetting for a moment that this entire evening had begun as an experiment. But the peace did not last long. At a table nearby, a cluster of well-dressed men and women who had clearly noticed the mismatch between Ethan's easy confidence and Naomi's plain appearance began to whisper among themselves, their voices rising just enough to be heard. Their laughter carrying a sharp, deliberate edge, meant to be overheard rather than hidden. One man dressed in an expensive tailored jacket leaned over with a smirk and said loud enough for the whole table to hear that it looked like somebody's blind date had gone badly. Naomi felt her stomach tighten, the old familiar sting of being reduced to nothing more than her outfit rising up in her chest. A woman at the same table, clearly trying to be helpful in the cruelest possible way, turned to Ethan and told him with false sympathy that a man like him deserved someone more beautiful. The words hung in the air, sharp and humiliating, and for a moment, Naomi wanted nothing more than to disappear entirely. Ethan did not flinch. He did not laugh along to save face, and he did not apologize for her presence the way so many men before him had done in far gentler situations. He simply turned toward the woman, his expression calm and unbothered, and told her that the greatest beauty a person could carry was in how they treated others, not in how they looked while doing it. The table fell into an awkward silence, and Ethan turned back to Naomi, as though nothing had happened at all, picking the conversation back up exactly where they had left off. Naomi sat frozen for a moment, her throat tight, unable to fully process what she had just witnessed. He continued speaking, telling her about his mother, who had battled a serious illness for years when he was young, and how watching the world treat her differently once she lost her hair, and her strength had taught him something he never forgot. He described how neighbors who once waved warmly began crossing the street to avoid awkward conversations, how her closest friends slowly stopped calling, how the woman who had raised him single-handedly through some of the hardest years of his childhood had been quietly erased from other people's attention the moment she stopped looking the way they expected her to look. He said he had learned at an early age never to measure another person's worth by what he could see on the surface, because the people who looked the most ordinary often carried the most extraordinary hearts, and because his mother, even in her weakest moments, had remained the strongest person he had ever known. Naomi felt tears gathering behind her eyes, and she blinked them back quickly, unwilling to let this stranger see just how deeply his words had landed. Across the restaurant, tucked into a corner booth with a menu held up just high enough to hide her face, Vanessa Cole watched the entire exchange unfold, her heart pounding with something between hope and disbelief, wondering if her best friend had finally found the one person in the city who did not care about the size of her bank account. After dinner, Naomi suggested they walk through the park a few blocks away, instead of calling it a night, unwilling to let the evening end so soon, surprising herself with how reluctant she felt to say goodbye to a man she had known for barely 2 hours. Ethan agreed without hesitation, offering his jacket when a cool breeze rolled through the trees, the gesture so natural and unforced that Naomi almost forgot to thank him. They talked easily as they walked beneath rows of old oak trees strung with soft evening light, the conversation drifting from childhood memories to the kind of quiet dreams people rarely admit out loud. Ethan mentioning once, almost in passing, that he still wanted to build a home with his own hands, someday, something small and solid that would outlast him. Halfway through the park, they passed a man sitting on a bench, his belongings gathered in a worn duffel bag beside him, asking passers-by if anyone could spare something to eat. His voice was hoarse and quiet, the kind of voice that had learned long ago not to expect much from the people hurrying past. Most people walked past, without breaking stride, their eyes fixed straight ahead, some crossing to the opposite side of the path entirely. to avoid the discomfort of acknowledging him, and Naomi braced herself for Ethan to do the same already, preparing the small, familiar disappointment she had grown used to feeling in moments like this. Instead, he stopped walking, almost immediately reached into the paper bag he had asked the restaurant to pack with his leftovers, and knelt down to hand it over with a warm smile and a simple exchange of words, asking the man how his evening was going as though they were old acquaintances catching up, rather than strangers crossing paths for the first and only time. He did not pull out his phone to capture the moment. He did not glance around to see if anyone was watching him do a good deed. He simply did it quietly, and then continued walking beside Naomi, as though nothing remarkable had occurred at all. Naomi understood in that instant that she was not witnessing a performance crafted for her benefit, because a performance requires an audience, and Ethan had not known anyone but her was there to see it. For the first time since she had begun this strange experiment, something dangerous and unfamiliar began to bloom in her chest, something that felt uncomfortably close to hope. She allowed herself, just for a moment, to imagine what it might feel like to build a life with someone like this. The peace of the evening broke suddenly, when Naomi's phone buzzed against her palm with an urgent call from her company's board of directors, the screen lighting up with a name that would have revealed everything if Ethan happened to glance down. Her stomach dropped as she angled the phone away from him. Instinctively, a reflex built from years of protecting her identity in public spaces, though this time the instinct felt heavier, tangled up with a fear she had not expected to feel, the fear of losing something before it had even truly begun. She silenced the call quickly, but her assistant, unaware of the situation, tried again, moments later through a video call instead, and before Naomi could stop it, a single word slipped through the speaker, before she managed to end the call entirely. The word was "Madam," followed immediately by the beginning of the title, "CEO cut off," just as Naomi's thumb slammed against the screen. Her heart pounded as she shoved the phone back into her bag, offering a quick, unconvincing explanation that she simply worked in an office, and her assistant had a habit of being overly formal. Ethan studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable, but he did not press her for more information, did not demand an explanation, did not treat her sudden nervousness as evidence of some hidden scandal. Naomi found herself unable to resist, asking whether he was even curious about what she had just hidden from him, whether the mystery bothered him at all. He looked at her with a gentle, steady patience, and told her simply that if she wanted to share something with him, he would listen, and if she was not ready, that was fine too, because he was not interested in unwrapping her like a gift she had not offered. Something inside Naomi shifted at those words, a wall she had spent years reinforcing, beginning to crack just slightly at the foundation. She realized with a kind of quiet astonishment that trust was beginning to take root in a place she had long believed was permanently closed off. Their fragile, private evening shattered entirely when a familiar voice called out across the park, sharp with recognition and disbelief. Grant Holloway, a wealthy businessman Naomi had turned down for a second date months earlier after he spent an entire evening discussing his real estate portfolio without asking her a single question about herself, was walking his dog nearby, and he stopped in his tracks the moment he registered the woman standing beside Ethan. His eyes moved over her disheveled appearance with obvious confusion before locking onto her face, and recognition flooded his expression all at once, replaced almost instantly by a smug, satisfied smile, as though he had just uncovered a secret worth broadcasting to the entire city. Grant's voice rose loud enough for several nearby strangers to hear as he announced with a mixture of shock and something that resembled satisfaction that the woman standing in front of him was Naomi Brooks, the CEO of Brooks Capital Holdings, one of the wealthiest women in the entire country, adding with a pointed glance toward Ethan that he wondered just how long it would take before the truth came out. A hush fell over the small crowd gathered nearby heads, turning phones, lowering expressions, shifting from indifference to stunned disbelief within seconds. The very people who had mocked her at the restaurant earlier that evening, who had whispered behind their hands about her outfit and her plainness, suddenly could not apologize fast enough, falling over themselves to explain that they had simply not recognized her, as though recognition alone have changed their cruelty into kindness. The restaurant manager, somehow already alerted, came rushing out to offer her a private table, a bottle of champagne. Anything at all to make amends for a slight that had cost the establishment nothing, until her identity became known. Ethan stood beside her through all of it, quiet and observant, absorbing the sudden transformation of everyone around them with a calm, unreadable expression. For the first time since dinner had begun, he learned exactly who the woman beside him truly was, not through her own words, but through the sudden, desperate reverence of strangers. Naomi watched Ethan closely, waiting for the shift she had seen in every man before him, the subtle change in posture, the flicker of calculation behind the eyes, the sudden interest in details he had not cared about moments earlier. It never came. Instead, Ethan turned to her with the same steady expression he had worn all evening and said quietly that she must have been carrying an extraordinary amount of pressure for a very long time, hiding something so large behind such an ordinary evening, and that he could not imagine what it must feel like to never fully know whether the people around you wanted your company or simply wanted access to your name. He did not ask about her net worth. He did not ask about her company's stock performance or her upcoming board decisions or the size of the penthouse she likely owned. He simply looked at her, as though the revelation had changed nothing at all about who she was to him, as though the woman he had pulled a chair out for at the beginning of the night was the same woman standing in front of him now, regardless of the title attached to her name. Naomi felt something crack open inside her chest, a mixture of relief and disbelief, so overwhelming that she had to look away for a moment to compose herself. She turned back to him, her voice quieter than she intended, and asked whether he wanted to end the evening now that everything had come out into the open, whether the truth had changed his willingness to be there with her at all. It was a test disguised as a question, one final measure of a man who had already passed every test she had unknowingly placed in front of him throughout the entire night. And Naomi held her breath, waiting for his answer, half expecting him to hesitate, half expecting the familiar shift in tone that always came once the numbers entered the conversation. Ethan answered without hesitation, his voice steady, and certain, saying that the woman he had agreed to meet that evening was named Naomi, not a bank account, not a headline, not a title printed on a business card. He told her that nothing about the last 2 hours had felt like an act, and nothing about who she turned out to be made those 2 hours any less real. He added quietly that if anything, learning the truth only made him more certain of what he had already sensed from the very first moment he pulled out her chair, that she was someone worth knowing, regardless of what surrounded her name. Naomi felt tears rise in her eyes for the first time that night, and this time she did not fight them back, letting them fall freely in front of a man she had met only hours earlier. A stranger who somehow understood her more deeply in one evening than most people had managed in years. They continued walking through the park long after the crowd had dispersed the city, lights glowing softly around them, and Naomi found herself confessing things she had never spoken aloud to anyone outside of Vanessa. She told him about the men who had pursued her only for her wealth, about the proposal that came with a legal document instead of a declaration of love, about the years she had spent building walls so thick that she sometimes forgot there was a woman still living behind them. She admitted in a voice barely above a whisper that she had begun to believe something was fundamentally wrong with her, that perhaps she was simply not the kind of woman men could love without an incentive attached, a belief she had carried quietly for so long that saying it aloud felt like setting down a weight she had forgotten she was still holding. Ethan listened without interrupting, without offering hollow promises or grand declarations meant to prove himself worthy in the moment. When she finally finished speaking, he told her simply that she did not owe anyone proof of her value. Not him, not the board members who called her at inconvenient hours, not the strangers in the restaurant who had needed her name before they could see her worth. Before they parted ways that night, Naomi made a decision that surprised even herself, inviting Ethan to visit her company's headquarters the following week, wanting him to see the world she came from, and wanting more than anything to see how that world would react to him in return. When Ethan arrived at the gleaming glass headquarters of Brooks Capital Holdings the following week, dressed in the same modest, well-kept suit he had worn on their first date, the reaction from the staff was immediate, unmistakable. He rode the elevator alongside junior analysts who eyed his worn briefcase with obvious skepticism, and by the time he reached the 40th floor, word had already spread through half the building that the CEO had brought a stranger into the office. Executives exchanged glances in the hallways, whispering behind closed doors about the ordinary-looking man walking beside their CEO, some assuming without hesitation that he was nothing more than an opportunist chasing her fortune. A few senior directors made pointed, thinly veiled comments during introductions, questioning his background and his qualifications with a condescension they did not bother to disguise. Naomi felt her protective instincts rise, but she said nothing, choosing instead to let Ethan's actions speak louder than anyone's assumptions ever could. Watching quietly, as one director in particular went so far as to ask with a tight smile, whether Ethan had ever set foot inside a boardroom before that afternoon. During a tense meeting concerning a massive infrastructure project, one valued at several $100 million, Ethan noticed something in the engineering plans displayed on the boardroom screen that made him sit forward in his chair. He raised his hand politely and pointed out a structural miscalculation buried deep within the technical drawings, an error that, if left uncorrected, could have led to catastrophic failure and staggering financial losses down the line. The room fell silent as the company's lead engineers scrambled to verify his claim, flipping through pages of calculations with growing alarm on their faces. Within the hour, it became clear that Ethan Walker, the man several executives had dismissed as an unqualified outsider, had just identified a flaw that an entire team of highly paid professionals had overlooked entirely. The atmosphere in the boardroom shifted entirely after that moment, skepticism giving way to genuine astonishment. As Ethan calmly walked the stunned engineers through a detailed solution, drawing on years of experience from his time as a combat engineer, overseeing complex infrastructure projects under far more demanding conditions than a corporate office could ever present. Naomi watched from the head of the table, pride swelling in her chest, as she observed the very people who had doubted him, now leaning forward, hanging on his every word, scribbling notes as fast as they could write. It was in that moment that Naomi understood something profound, something that went far beyond the tenderness he had shown her during their first date. She had not simply found a kind man wandering through the world with a good heart and nothing else to offer. She had found someone with genuine competence, genuine intelligence, and a quiet confidence that never once needed to announce itself loudly to be respected. Over the following weeks, Naomi found herself inviting Ethan back to the office more frequently, watching him earn the trust of colleagues who had once mocked him behind closed doors, watching skepticism transform slowly into admiration as his contributions proved themselves again and again. She began to realize that the qualities which had drawn her to him on that first strange, humbling evening were not separate from his professional value, but deeply intertwined with it, because a man who treated a stranger on a park bench with dignity was the same man who would treat an entire engineering team with honesty and respect regardless of what he stood to gain. As the weeks passed and their relationship deepened, Naomi made an offer she had never extended to anyone outside her closest inner circle, inviting Ethan to join Brooks Capital Holdings in a formal advisory role, overseeing infrastructure projects across the company's expanding portfolio. To her surprise, Ethan declined the position almost immediately, explaining with quiet conviction that he had no interest in being handed a title simply because of who he was dating. He told her he wanted to be evaluated the same way any other candidate would be evaluated, through his actual work and his actual results, not through the shortcut of a relationship that could easily be mistaken for favoritism. He suggested instead that she post the role publicly and let him apply through the same process as anyone else, an idea so unusual to Naomi that she sat in stunned silence for a moment before agreeing, unable to recall a single person in her professional life who had ever turned down an advantage that was freely offered. Naomi found herself falling deeper into respect for him with every conversation, recognizing in his refusal the same integrity that had first caught her attention in that small, unremarkable restaurant weeks earlier. Not everyone around them shared her admiration, however. and Grant Holloway, still stinging from Naomi's earlier rejection and unable to accept that a modest engineer had succeeded where his own wealth and status had failed, began quietly, spreading rumors throughout their professional circle, mentioning Ethan's name at galas and charity dinners with a practiced casualness designed to plant doubt rather than announce it outright. He suggested to anyone who would listen that Ethan was nothing more than a calculated opportunist, a man who had orchestrated the entire blind date encounter once he learned who Naomi truly was, using her vulnerability for his own financial gain. The rumors spread quickly through certain circles, whispered in boardrooms, and repeated at charity galas, threatening to tarnish the reputation Ethan had worked so carefully to build on his own merit. Ethan, true to the character Naomi had come to know, so well refused to dignify the accusations with a public response, choosing instead to continue his work quietly and let his actions stand as the only defense he needed. Naomi, however, was not willing to stay silent, while someone tried to diminish the man who had shown her more genuine respect than anyone else in her adult life, and she stood before the company's entire board of directors to defend him, publicly, her voice steady and unwavering as she dismantled every baseless claim point by point. In the weeks that followed, as the whispers finally began to fade, and Ethan's reputation with an audience that had once mocked her without knowing her name, she called a press conference, a decision that stunned even Vanessa, who had spent years watching Naomi avoid personal questions from reporters with practiced skill, always steering interviews back toward earnings and expansion plans whenever anyone tried to ask about her personal life. On the morning of the announcement, cameras filled the hall of a downtown auditorium, reporters from national outlets crowding shoulder to shoulder, none of them entirely certain what kind of statement warranted this level of attention from a clued woman who had spent her entire career avoiding the spotlight for anything other than business. Standing before a room full of journalists and cameras, Naomi told the story of the blind date exactly as it happened, admitting openly that she had deliberately dressed in worn, unremarkable clothing and dulled her appearance in an attempt to discover whether any man could see past the surface to the person underneath. The room fell into a stunned hush as she spoke, reporters exchanging glances, several lowering their notepads entirely as they listened. She told them plainly that she had not been searching for someone who wanted to love a billionaire, but for someone capable of loving the woman who existed long before the billions ever entered the picture. She spoke of the stranger who had shared his dinner with a man on a park bench without asking for recognition, of the man who had defended her dignity in a restaurant before he had any idea who she was, of the man who had corrected a costly engineering error. Not to impress her, but simply because it was the right thing to do. She thanked Ethan publicly, her voice thick with emotion, for proving that his character never wavered whether he believed no one was watching or whether the entire world was watching at once. Ethan, standing quietly near the back of the room, remained exactly as unassuming as he had been on the night they met, never once stepping forward to claim the spotlight for himself, content instead to let Naomi's words carry the moment. In the months that followed, Naomi and Ethan channeled everything they had learned from their extraordinary beginning into something lasting, founding a scholarship fund and a vocational training program aimed at giving overlooked and underestimated people the same chance Ethan himself had once been given, an opportunity built on genuine merit rather than appearances or connections. They named the initiative after Ethan's mother, a small gesture that meant more to him than any title Naomi could have offered inside her company. And the first class of scholarship recipients included a young, single mother studying structural engineering at night while working 2 jobs during the day, and a 19-year-old former foster kid who had never once been told by an adult that he was capable of something extraordinary. The program grew quickly, expanding across several cities, offering training in skilled trades and engineering fields to young people who had never been handed an easy path in life, each of them chosen not for their polish, but for their potential, evaluated through interviews that Ethan insisted on conducting personally, because he refused to let anyone else make the same mistake others had once made about him. Word of their story spread far beyond the financial circles, where Naomi had once been known only as a headline, reaching ordinary people across the country who found something deeply familiar in a tale about being seen for who you truly are, rather than what you appear to be. Newspapers ran features on the couple, focusing not on their wealth or their status, but on the simple, radical idea that kindness offered without expectation of reward could quietly reshape an entire life. Vanessa, watching from the sidelines, as she so often had admitted to Naomi one evening, that she had never truly believed the experiment would work, that she had expected the blind date to end in disappointment like so many before it. Naomi simply smiled and told her friend that she had stopped believing in coincidences the moment a stranger pulled out her chair without knowing her name meant anything at all. Months later, Naomi and Ethan returned to the same small restaurant where their story had first begun, though this time Naomi arrived dressed exactly as herself in a tailored dress that reflected the woman she truly was, without disguise or deflection. She no longer needed to hide behind worn clothing to discover the truth about the man across the table from her because she already knew it completely. As she walked through the door, Ethan rose from his seat exactly as he had the very first time, pulling out her chair with the same unhurried warmth, looking at her with the same steady, unguarded eyes that had first convinced her something rare was sitting across from her. Later that evening, as they stepped outside into the cool night air, after leaving a small, quiet coffee shop down the street, Naomi reached for his hand, feeling the same sense of certainty she had felt on that very first evening, when a stranger in a worn suit had chosen to see her as a person before he ever knew she was anything else. She thought back to all the years she had spent guarding herself against a world that only seemed to want pieces of her. The meetings, the mergers, the endless calculations of what people believed she was worth on paper, and she realized that none of it had prepared her for how simple real connection actually was once she stopped searching for it in all the wrong places. Ethan squeezed her hand gently and told her, in the same quiet, unhurried voice he had used since the very beginning, that he never needed her to be extraordinary, because he had fallen for her on an evening when she looked by every outward measure entirely ordinary. Both of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, that the simple decision to treat a stranger with dignity, made on an ordinary evening, by a man who expected nothing in return, had quietly opened the door to a future that neither of them could have possibly imagined. It was proof, carried forward in every scholarship awarded and every life changed through their foundation, that the truest measure of a person is never found in what they wear or what they own, but in the quiet, unwitnessed choices they make when I believe no one is watching at all. And as they walked together, down the quiet street, the city lights stretching out ahead of them like a promise neither one intended to break.